to our first guest speaker. We're very delighted to have with us today the Group CEO and Chief Architect at the Arab Engineering Bureau, Mr. Ibrahim Jada. Mr. Ibrahim has won several awards, including the Islamic Cities Award and State Encouragement Award. He is also the person behind the beautifully designed Al Tamama Stadium. The design of the stadium was entrusted of Arab Engineering Bureau and its GCEO and Chief Architect, Mr. Ibrahim Jada, back in 2015. He will be discussing with us today his book, The History of Qatari Architecture from the 1800s to 1950. There's also a copy of the book with all the attendees, so you can enjoy flipping through the book whilst Mr. Ibrahim is presenting the talk. It is actually the first book to examine the geographical, historical, and functional aspects of architecture in Qatar. I hope you enjoy this talk today. Please welcome with me Mr. Ibrahim Jada.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good afternoon, everybody. This book, History of Qatari Architecture, as way back in the days when I studied in the School of Architecture in the States, there was no reference whatsoever for me to use. And what we studied at the university about the Islamic architecture was very brief knowledge that they have given us. So as soon as I came back, I started collecting data about our vernacular architecture just out of hobby and taking pictures, but eventually I documented this in this book, and I called it, I put the dates between 1800 to 1850. Simply 1800 is when the formation of the country started taking real shape, and in 1950, sorry, 1800 to 1950, and 1950 is the beginning of the oil era. And simply that era of vernacular architecture sort of came to almost to a halt. Now I'm trying to relate the book into, since we are hosting, or we are the capital with the great honor of the Islamic culture, since Qatar is the capital, I wanted to relate this also to the wider Islamic nation that has also influenced Qatar like it did many other places in the world. So since the beginning of Islam, started in this small little town, Mecca al-Mukarramah, and from it has expanded all over the world in many, many places, and so many civilizations have been influenced by it. And these diagrams or these maps actually shows the growth of the Islamic empire and in its different eras. And there was these wonderful stories about young people that led these armies, 20-year-old and 21-year-old soldiers leading the armies to go and expand the Islamic world into the most important and powerful, the Romans and the Persians and so on, into Africa. And of course, with this expansion, there has been a lot of influence. It's not like the expansion that happens in today's politics where destruction happens. That was on the contrary, totally the opposite. There was a big influence, and nations have thrived, and the civilization have become much, much more developed with science, with technology, and I'll show you how this has affected even the architecture. And everywhere it went, it definitely it took the essence of Islam, but yet it had its own influence by the existing civilizations. So when it went to China, it has adopted some Chinese architecture and so on, all the way to Africa and into Europe. And different examples, of course, the great, in Spain, Cordoba, Alhambra, and all the influences that it happened over there. Now, again, it has not only affected the architecture, but also the economy. I mean, it was a thriving civilization. I don't know if you know it, the gowns that graduates all over the world wear, the black gown. It was back in the days, people that went to get educated in Andalusia wore the gown just to, when they go back home, just to show that they've been educated in such a nice civilization in this Arab world or in the Islamic world. And it's in its own forms. It has influenced even smaller areas within the Africa, and the architecture of the masjid has also become like in any religion, the religious architecture becomes a monument. So in different formation, and I'm showing you these different contrast of examples to eventually lead into our own vernacular architecture. And we see these influences. And of course, in Cairo, as it was one of the most important cities of the civilizations back in the days in the Islamic architecture, the Ibn Tulun Mosque is something to see. Every time I go to Cairo, I wouldn't miss it. It's more than 1,000 years old, and it has still inspired a lot of architects throughout eras and eras. Even our Islamic Museum of Islamic Arts has this building in the center has influenced IMP into conceiving some of the geometry adopted in this magnificent museum of ours. And of course, Baghdad, everybody knows how important it was. Definitely the capital of the world back in the days. They were doing eye operations when Europe was in the dark ages. So did, again, thrive all these cities with its knowledge and openness, the open-mindedness, and the influence on architecture was flourishing in its different forms and influences wherever it went. And of course, Damascus, Syria as a whole, that also had great influences. And of course, being part of the Roman Empire and Constantinople, it brought also some of these influences into the Islamic architecture. And I think Islamic architecture has reached some of its richest forms in Damascus. And in different areas, whether it's, and of course, the Ottoman Empire and its expansion and influence in the architecture, the genius that it has adopted from the civilizations that existed and developed this into a more magnificent architecture also has developed. And of course, within Iran, these wind towers that you see in the screen on the right, actually under these beautiful domes and sculpture-like building, there are the water reservoirs for the whole villages, and this will definitely did cool down all these central water system. Different places also of the Samarkand, of course, and all the way to the influence of the great Mughal architecture, which interestingly, some of our early modern architecture that you see in the Diwan Amiri and so on, I feel that there has been the architects that has conceived these pointed arches where it had some sort of an influence of the architecture of the Mughal or the Indian architecture. So having said all that, we go into the actual subject, which is the book. Now, Qatar, naturally, being in the Arabian Peninsula, was one of the early, as Islam expanded, it has influenced it. But being such small areas and there was not much population, but even though there was history way back before even early Islam and way before that, which I'll share with you now. And we go back to the Mesopotamians era when it was the whole world was around this area. In this region, most of the knowledge and the early human thinking started within these ancient areas. And the Gilgamesh, of course, the mythology of the Gilgamesh and the pearls and all this history developed into this region. And definitely there was an influence when we start talking about the fishing and the pearl diving. And we're still fortunate, interestingly, Qatar, the best pearl diving areas, as we're blessed now with our oil and gas, we were blessed with the most important pearl diving locations right off the shores of Doha, right in front of us. So people even from Kuwait and Basra will have to come closer to Qatar and to this part of the Gulf to get the best pearls in the world. And then we start getting into the actual prototypes of the building. So if you go through the book, I wanted to divide it into the different type of constructions that existed. Of course, the oldest forms of construction that remained were the forts, naturally being in this part of the world as tribes, different tribes. There was different wars within the tribes and the different parts of the Gulf. So forts were extremely important, and some of them go back all the way within the region to the Portuguese and even before the Portuguese. So the architecture of the forts was extremely important. Marwub Fort is an older fort. Nobody knows really how it's the exact shape of it, but we know in plan how it's formed. And mostly, like most of the forts, square or a rectangle with the corner edges where the watchtowers will be formed. Zubara is quite famous. It was formed in the 30s. Still, thank God, it's very well protected and preserved. It's quite unique in its method of construction, even though it's the typical stone and wood construction back in the days, but it has this rectangular, one of the corners is a rectangular, and some of these were actually inhabited also at certain times, at certain periods. So people were actually living there. It's not only a fortress to protect, because it was protecting also some houses within the vicinity. I guess like any other protection or forts within any different parts of the world. Now, as I was doing the book, I was fortunate I got my hand into some surveys of some of the old buildings. The government has commissioned through municipality some firms to do some laser surveys and physical surveys on these buildings. And I put my hand into this in addition to all the photographs that I have taken. And from that, I started developing it. I didn't want to put photographs as it would be boring, and I wanted to become sort of a reference book. So we started sketching everything that I had and summarized it into these categories. So I think what's so unique about this book that everything is sketched rather than photographs, which I think gives it a nice architectural sort of form. And in that, we put sections, elevations, we developed whatever we could back in the days. Salah al-Muhammad Fort, this is a quite unique and important influence. It mixes between the sort of the residential architecture and the forts, and the slanted type of towers, which comes of the Najdi style of architecture, has been mixed into this sort of residential and fortress. So it's not your typical rectangle or square. It was like a residence, yet it had this fortress uniqueness. This has influenced me personally in several of my works, but I have reflected this mostly in the Ministry of Interior, that big building where near the fire station, and you see the slanted towers. That's how I have reflected that. But definitely, this was what has influenced me into getting inspired into another form of fortress. This is protected, still not opened to the public or not to rehabilitated to be used, but at least the building has been fortunately protected. These are the different elevation, and you can see the uniqueness of the slanted, definite influence of the Najd style of architecture, and of course, in addition to the simple dwellings. Interestingly, we did, as I will share with you as we go on, we did an interesting research with Harvard, and when we developed the Gulf Encyclopedia, and we have taken some villages within the Gulf Basin, within the Arab side and the Iranian side, which were small Arab towns actually, on the other side, Arab-speaking towns, that is. And the similarity in the architecture was quite unique. And this is as we've seen different civilizations, or influences of the Islamic architecture in different places, I think how special this Gulf basin, its unique style of architecture makes it quite special among the rest of the architecture of the whole world. So it's very, very well defined, and I think it's underexplored or exposed to the rest of the world. So that was an opportunity when we worked with Harvard and that nice encyclopedia sponsored by Mishera Properties that has really documented this style of architecture finally in an international level. Now, these towers were very common throughout Qatar. So there was one in Al Khor, in Barzan Tower. These were used also as watchtowers to see. This goes way back in the 1800s also, to see if there is any tribes or anybody coming. It's like literally a watchtower to say who's coming. We go to the palaces. Of course, this is one of the most important buildings because of its scale, of its status. It's important. The ruler, Sheikh Abdullah, was there, and Sheikh Hamad bin Abdullah also was there. So it was an important era also because the Ottomans were still in Qatar, and the Qal'at al-Askar, where the Diwan Amiri was like the Ottoman fort, exactly where the Diwan Amiri was. And the ruler was here, and it said that the Ottoman Shawish or what lieutenant would come, Pasha would come every day in the afternoon and drink tea with the ruler here, crossing the Souq Waqif area. So this was really a dominant place, and it's like also defining that the capital of Doha and the presence of the government during even the Ottomans and of course the British later, but during the Ottomans it was an important, even though Rayyan was also like the ruler's area, but this is like the Doha and controlling the economy in a very important geographic location. Unfortunately, as you all have noticed with the new museum, this became like a part of the antiquity that is displayed within the new museum, which I think it was very smartly done. And the building in the center, I would call this like the Acropolis of the Qatari architecture. This is the most important statement in the Qatari architecture. So if you would tell me what building would reflect the Qatari identity and its richness into proportions, into the liwan, the arches, the carvings, that center building that still exists within the museum, it was a majlis-like in the heart of the family majlis, not in the edges. In the edges, if you go to the museum, is where you receive guests. But this was, interestingly, in the center of the whole compound, the palace compound. And I have a little sculpture that it was a gift given by the late Sheikh Khalifa when they opened this museum in 1972. These were the gifts given to all the heads of state that came, and it became like a little piece of antique. Managed to grab this through some auction internationally, but that also it reflects the importance that this main building was even used as a souvenir celebrating the opening of the museum. The restoration of this building has won us the Aga Khan Award for the state of Qatar back in the days. And of course, the different gates, interestingly, the layout of this whole palace, each gate had a meaning. One gate was facing the souk area, so the merchants as they come back, the pearl divers as they come back, they would come and greet the ruler through this door. And there was a door also facing the sea where the ruler would see the boats coming in and out of the bay. That was very important to see who's in and out of town. And the little majlis also, this is on the edge. Again, all these wonderful recesses, as decorative as they may appear, this is a section looking inside which we call the roshana. These were shelves and niches that you use inside, but they were not only done for decorative reason. As you build with stones, you want to create a lighter weight walls, and so you would put thinner walls, and that's usually they would get from the seashore. It's a flat type of stones from the sea, and they would put them sideways just to make the walls thinner. But they didn't do them just thin for structural reason. They started getting creative and making it a decorative feature also. And that's where the creativity in innovating the material available. Even we had very limited materials available to construct. And I'll show you the other examples. And of course, the carvings. This museum has also managed to sort of document all the local carvings that were available. And it's been documented, my dear friend and Muhammad Ali Abdullah has documented this in his book, where he have even named each carving had a name. The roses, the cashew nuts, some even pigeon footsteps in the moonlight, some very romantic names, all these beautiful carvings. The chain, the silsila al-maflula, it had all sorts of different names that has been documented in these and being redone in the museum. The houses, there is tons of houses that has been published in this book. I've selected few examples just to show you the difference. Basically, the houses, well, the whole towns and the villages were grew in a very sort of organic manner. So you would have this courtyard house, and as your sons grow, you would build a room for them, and so on. And the same thing happens into the neighborhood. Your brothers, your cousins, and the extended neighbors and the family. So that's why when you see an old aerial photograph, not only here, but in any older villages or towns, it grows organically. But the interesting part is that how did these people manage to live in such a hot environment? And there was really a genius way of adapting to this environment, even though there was work opportunities with the pearl diving industry and so on. But for them to be able to live in this environment, they were very responsive to the environment. When we have analyzed these buildings, they don't have window openings on the west side, for example, and every breeze of wind meant something to them. So the way they have adapted this architecture to the environment made them manage to live. And in that same encyclopedia that Harvard did, they took the old Jasra area and they rebuilt them virtually in the computer, and realized that at least there is 10 degrees difference between the sikkas and the courtyards and the outside back in the days. So, and that's why now when I even talk to the youngsters about how environmentally friendly we should be, just by, I think, responding to our environment, we would achieve quite a bit into environment, to become environmentally conscious to our architecture and making it more suitable to us. Other examples, I mean, the proportions are simply gorgeous, and even the staircases become a sculptural piece, and because simply form was following the function, and you would build exactly what you need, and you didn't need to exaggerate anything. Again, all the recesses, as you see in these elevations, are made not only for aesthetical purpose, but also they were a structural element. And the little room that the recesses you see inside the roshana became a sort of a functional. This is where you put your decorative features or whatever furniture you have around that. This is the Muhammad Saeed Nasrallah's house. Wind towers were not known in Qatar. I don't know whether it's the masons or the environment itself, even though we have some humidity these days. But I think our dry weather didn't require long wind towers. Our wind towers were a simpler form on the parapets of the roof where you see recesses. The picture on the right, the recesses on the parapet, the wind would slide into the roof, and as the roof was inhabited by in certain times of the year, people would literally sleep on the roof. So this wind would slide in. But the Nasrallah's house, historically, they say there was 3 wind towers in Qatar, and a couple in the Souk and in Nasrallah's house. This is preserved now in near Souk al-Najada. So it was unique and it was documented. I sat under this wind tower and you really could feel the wind blowing inside. There it is in elevation. And these pattern mashrabiyya like again, I'll have allowed the wind to go through the mashrabiyas, yet it gives the privacy. That's a section in the wind tower. Actually, it plays an interesting role. It does not only catch the wind, but it creates a negative pressure in the courtyard, so the wind gets really moving in. I've heard stories of older people, they would put wood cloth, so when the wind touches the wind cloth, it will cool down as it goes into the courtyard. Another courtyard building. Now, you've seen the museums, fortunately, in Msharib, where very similar architecture is. And all the arcades shaded by what we call the liwan. So the rooms were used a certain time of the day, the liwan certain time also of the day because it's shaded, and the upper rooms and the roof. All different season, every place was utilized and inhabited to adapt to whatever weather outside is. And that's a good reason for cooling the area down and, of course, giving the privacy. I was comparing this type of architecture to what has been adopted to us, or when the new planners came in the 60s, and with no sensitivity towards this privacy thing, and all the plan of our new neighborhoods, we started getting these boundary lines with the boxes called villas inside, and we were deprived from being able to sit in the outdoor because there was no privacy simply. We're studying now, and we have managed to sort of recreate the essence of the good qualities of the old neighborhood into a modern life, which hopefully we will show in the near future. Again, the similar elements, but you'll see balconies, the use of the wood, even though we didn't have trees to spare to cut the wood, but most of the wood was coming from India, and the fancy stuff, doors and so on, from Zanzibar. And again, that's another beauty of our architecture, is that as people traveled for trading and for pearl diving, we got influences by different civilizations. Of course, the Persian across the sea, the Indian had a strong influence, and we had a good African influence through the trading also. Therefore, you see this reflected not only in the architecture, but in our musics, and in our accent, and our even cuisine. I sometimes joke with my Indian friends. I tell them that biryani is a Qatari food. It's not Indian, which is not the case, as you know. Al-Asma House. These are just different examples of different scale, and you see similar things. Some managed to build in the upper floor, and some didn't. But these recesses on the right, was catching the wind also into the room. And you would have a piece of wood under it. You open it when you want the wind, and if it's dusty, you wouldn't want to open it. You would close it. So it's a different form of wind catchers. A typical liwan. These corner treatments that look like half a moon, and some say it looks like the falcon mouth, but actually, even though it was structural, again, it became a sort of a decorative element. And we've seen different forms, geometrical forms for these beautiful corners. And you see the pieces of wood sticking out. Now you see them in Souk Waqif, and some people that depict the local vernacular, they would put these pieces of wood. And the intention was simply, it's not a decorative reason. Your dentil or your piece of wood is an asset. So you would never cut the piece of wood. So you would lay them down. If they stick out, you leave them sticking out, because when you want to move out, you leave the walls, you remove the wood, your doors and windows and your dentils, and move and to build your house elsewhere. So it was taboo to cut your wood, because it's definitely waste. And imagine how things were sort of recycled and appreciated. course, the doors. I mean, there's a whole section of doors in different publications of how important the door is, and how welcoming it was, and the story of the big door with a smaller door within it, and the reason the smaller door, which we call al-farkha, was made small, so when you enter into the courtyard, you bend down, you don't look straight in, out of respect and out of privacy. So every little thing had a meaning and had a story to tell. Sheikh Hamad bin Abdullah's house. This is the great-grandfather of the ruler. And this is one of the houses in Doha, built back in the 30s. And that's, you see how the elevation, again, all these recesses, some are to catch the wind in the upper area, and item number 2, this is where the wind slides in. As kids, I remember we slide our head into that. Another element. And then I'll go to the mosques, because these are the most beautiful sculptural-like, especially the minarets, with the limited capability of how to construct these elements with the stones and the limited number of wood. So people started forming them in a different way. Unfortunately, even though we lost a lot of the vernacular architecture has been demolished during the beginning of the oil period, nobody would want to demolish a mosque. So there was a lot of masjids around that has been protected. And you could do a whole book just about these masjids, and most of them have been restored. Some lost their minarets and were yet to determine how their shape would look like, but you could see simply very smaller rooms, and the width, the depth of the prayer area based on how much wood you have and what's the length of the wood. So the material has dominated. I mean, look at that. I'll have to run through the last few minutes just to share with you the different styles of the masjids. This form of minaret became sort of popular later in the 60s and in the 70s. It got a little bit more of decorative features. This is in Salata, it's here in Doha. Again, the feature. So basically, the shaded areas and then into the masjid. And you can see the minarets, none of them is similar to the other, all unique in their own rights. And public buildings, there wasn't really, the police station in Al-Khor, it's protected also. I have managed to document there wasn't many of the public buildings available to sort of, most of them were gone. This still exists. Souq al-Bakr is still in Souq Waqif. It still exists. And it's been restored, fortunately. You can get the best kebab there. That's a majlis. That's it. Thank you. I made it on time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ibrahim. I'm honestly not from an architecture background, and I personally did learn a lot of new facts that are quite interesting about architecture, especially the history of Qatari architecture. So thank you once again for sharing with us your expertise. All right, next up we have Dr. Akel Ismail Kahira. He is a professor of Islamic architecture and urbanism at the College of Islamic Studies at HBKU. His research, teaching, and scholarly publications include architecture, sustainable urbanism, and also design. With over 20 years as a professional practitioner, he has performed a vital role as a designer and project manager, primarily in the international arena. He will be reflecting with us today on Islamic architecture and the Museum of Islamic Art. Please welcome with us Dr. Akel. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Ibrahim. I really enjoyed your inspiring talk, and it's a hard act to follow, but as a New Yorker, I never sort of, allow myself to be scared of any challenges. You have to if you want to survive in New York City. You really basically laid out a timeline which sort of makes my presentation really a lot easier. You mentioned the Ibn Tulun Mosque, which I'm going to talk about today. And you also sort of gave a chronology which ended in 1950. And I want to connect the date and the time to the MIA, but to focus on the work of the architect I.M. Pei. As many of you know, he was the architect for this museum. He sadly passed away in 2019. Is this on full screen? Okay, all right. So IMPA, 1950, where sort of Ibrahim sort of ends. In 1950, IMPA was in the United States, in Massachusetts. He arrived in the year, I think, he was 18 years old. He was born in 1917. I'm trying to get the dates right. He was born in 1917. At 18 years old, he came to the United States to study architecture, first to the University of Pennsylvania, which he didn't stay very long. He left because their style of architecture was the Beaux-Arts school, and he wanted something a little bit more interesting. So he then moved to MIT, which is something I have in common with him. That's about all. We both graduated from MIT. And then he stayed there and studied architecture. I'm giving you a little bit of a background so you can contextualize how important architecture is and how important the practitioners of architecture have to really sort of delve into a little bit of history, a little bit of art, a little bit of sociology, and a whole host of other things that informs how we produce architecture. Nevertheless, I.M. Pei was at MIT during the years when the famous French architect Le Corbusier visited. And according to I.M. Pei, he said that those were the two best days of his education, meeting the French architect Le Corbusier. After graduating in 1940, he enrolled at Harvard University to study with Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius was the founder of the Bauhaus School of Architecture. Very important school. They were forced to leave Germany because of the sort of pressure that was imposed on them by the Third Reich, Hitler, and the sort of totalitarian regime which has no toleration for art or culture or anything. And so they came to the United States. Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, later on Mies van der Rohe, and many others. And they established a school at Harvard, which is where I.M. Pei studied. Now let me try to, I hope that's a good segue into the talk. I was happy that Ibrahim mentioned the Ibn Tulun Mosque because I.M. Pei says that this is the building, particularly the fountain, which you see in the courtyard, that inspired the MIA design. And I began to think about this in terms of genealogy. You all know what genealogy is, right? It's nasab, right? We all have ancestors, and we can trace ourselves all the way back to Adam. Maybe not really, but we know that Adam was the forefather. So that is genealogy. Architecture has its own genealogy, right? And so I began to think of this. How would I talk about I.M. Pei without not including a kind of a genealogical understanding of what informs his proposal for the MIA. So this is how I'm kind of shaping this whole discussion. So on one hand, you have I.M. Pei. On the other hand, you have this long tradition of Islamic architecture. But on the one hand, you also have Pei as someone who is coming from China, a very rich culture and heritage. He talks about the influence of his mother. He talks about Le Corbusier. And then on the other hand, we have this notion of Islamic architecture, including the influence of light and what influence that has on the way buildings are experienced. Geometry, how that informs the shape and space of buildings, and water. And I want to do a kind of analysis of those three elements. They are not the only elements that inform architecture. So let me begin with talking about Pei, a little bit about his own genealogy, his own thinking. So in his childhood years, before coming to the United States, he spent many summers in this garden, a famous garden, and he often reflects on how important it was to be exposed to that environment in his later years. Now, this is important because many of the biographers of Pei have written him up as a modernist. I don't fully subscribe to that idea because I think somewhere in his own upbringing, he was clearly influenced by what Ibrahim mentioned about this idea of the vernacular. And China, of course, had this strong architectural vernacular tradition, which he did not abandon, even though he was under the tutelage and the influence of the modernists, Gropius and others at Harvard. In fact, for his master's thesis, or for his thesis, he did a museum for this garden in China. So that tells you he did not abandon his tradition. The second thing is, his mother was a Buddhist. She was a well-known musician, an accomplished musician. And he says in many of the documents that I read that she single-handedly influenced him and taught him how to think, taught him about silence, how to reflect. And that's why I sort of use this term with the help of Neda. It had many other terms, but she basically told me, well, this is it. So I said reflections, right? How to reflect? How do we reflect? And then, of course, Pei's first museum, which he designed in upstate New York in 1968, 2 years after the death of Le Corbusier, is heavily influenced by Corbusier's use of forms and concrete and things of that nature. So that's one part of the genealogy, okay? The other part is when Pei decided to find inspiration. Where did he go? He went to Tunisia, he went to Cordoba, he went to Fatipur Sikri, he went to Tunisia, and he found it. He suddenly had an epiphany when he entered the Ibn Tulun Mosque. And he describes the fountain as a poem. This is interesting, this connection between poetry and architecture. Very interesting. As a matter of fact, there's a book called The Poetics of Space. Very important book. So here are some of his drawings. You can see how he's thinking about this idea. How do I create this sense of place, right? And how do I make it meaningful? Now, the people who have written about this describe this as the term being used as phenomenology. I will explain what that means shortly. So here he is in Cairo. He has this epiphany. He finally found what he was looking for. He was inspired by Cordoba, but it didn't work for him. He didn't really feel that that would allow him to approach the problem. And then, of course, we're going to talk about how that inspiration is translated into a form that becomes the MIA. So if we look at the site, first of all, Pei was worried why the building sits in this sort of solitary place. He was worried that future buildings would influence the way we perceive the building. In other words, there's no prediction, there's no predictability. No one can foretell what will happen in the future. Other buildings may come and overshadow it. And he, in the interest of protecting the aesthetics and the beauty of this wonderful, iconic building, we refer to it as iconic, but I think it's much more important than being iconic. It has a cultural message. Buildings, in essence, make statements. If you really pay attention to what Ibrahim was saying, they're making historical statements. They're telling you about the history, the people, how they live, how they slept, how they drank tea, where did they meet. That is the value of architecture. And I think for someone like myself, I can't speak for Ibrahim, I struggle with how do I translate the needs of a client into reality? Do I do it truthfully, superficially, or otherwise? And it's a burden, it's a burden. So the site is important. It's about place. It's about culture. And so he was thinking, as you saw in the previous sketches, about how to create this context that is truly a representation of place. Place and space are very important. They have power. They have meaning. Okay? So here we are. He decided to locate the building in this solitary way, sitting by itself. Now, how do we make this connection to Islamic architecture? This is a little bit more challenging because we tend to think of Islamic architecture both in terms of historical terms as an academic subject, but does it have meaning today? Can we take the knowledge of the past and use it in a contemporary sense? Can we translate that knowledge so that it becomes much more useful for us in this modern era that we live in? And the answer is yes, and I think that's what IMP was successful in doing, taking his inspiration once again from the Ibn Tulun Mosque. So if you look at this image here, the one on the left is a section through the building. It's like taking a wedding cake and cutting it in half, right? What do you see inside, right? Besides more cake, you see the layers, right? So that is what he's doing. And what you see are these two elements. One, the dome at the top, which I'll talk about in terms of light. And then you see this sort of protruding element, this glass element, which is on the north elevation of the building. See, it's surprising, I know Ibrahim knows this, because when you study architecture, they teach you about light. How does the sun move? If you're in the northern hemisphere, it moves a certain way. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it moves a certain way. If you're in Scandinavia, you could just forget it, right? So the northern elevation, which is the elevation that faces the bay, when the sun rises in the east and it moves to the west, and it does that every day, you can guarantee, you're going to get light coming in. The quality of light may vary depending on the day, shady, cloudy, winter, summer. But he paid attention to that. He paid attention to that element. So those of you who have gone to the MIA, you may have gone there at the daytime or at the nighttime. But if you're there around noon, you can see around the fountain where there's that small cafeteria, this quality of light that just comes in and just bathes that place. So we're talking about three elements now. And these are not the only elements, I want to remind you, that can be attached to Islamic architecture. That is light, geometry, and water, right? So light. Historically, there are many buildings, and the image you see at the lower left is the mosque of Isfahan, the older mosque, the Jami, Masjid al-Jami, where you can see the oculus coming in and bathing the Muqarrana's dome. This is a dome which has these sort of elements that are truncated, geometric triangles and so on. We call this muqarnas, right? This was truly an Islamic invention. It did not exist before. It sort of was introduced by Muslim architects. You see it in Spain, you see it in Iran, you see it throughout the Islamic world. And here you have an example. One of the things that IMP did is that he read books, okay, aside from travel. And this idea of travel is important, but reading is also important. One of my favorite American writers, Mark Twain, has a wonderful saying, perhaps one of the reasons I was inspired to come to Qatar. Although I had been in Saudi Arabia for almost 15 years practicing architecture, Twain has this wonderful saying, travel is the enemy of ignorance. Travel is the enemy of ignorance. Very powerful. I've often contemplated how valuable that is for me as an architect to go and see buildings and experience them, as opposed to just reading about them. Reading is important, but being there is as equally important. So here we have this idea of light. And what does IMP do? He sort of tries to emulate the Muqarnas dome, which you see at the top right, and at the bottom image, right below that dome, you have the same sort of experience where the light is coming in through the ceiling, through the roof, and as you look up, you see this coffered ceiling, this ceiling which has these sort of openings in it. So I believe that what he has done, he has sort of worked through his mind, how do I translate this historical legacy, this tradition, this very rich tradition of architecture into a modernist sort of interpretation? Very difficult to do, not easy. So a lot of modernist architects usually abandon tradition. But tradition is important. It's who we are, right? We cannot dismiss our genealogy, right? So the other example, aside from light, is geometry. Now, one of the best examples that I could think of, which comes close, is the idea of the octagon, which you see very carefully worked out in the MIA. There's this idea of the form taking the shape of an octagon. And one of the earliest examples of that is the Dome of the Rock, which was built in the 7th century by the Umayyads. It is a pure octagon. Of course, in the drawing next to it, IMP takes liberty in sort of not being faithful to the octagon in its true sense, but it comes close enough in terms of its resemblance. So geometry has this role to play in architecture. We cannot avoid it, right? Squares, circles, triangles, rhombuses, they all play a part, and they have structural value as well. That's how buildings stand up. You've got to work with your structural system to make it work, and so geometry has that role to play. The other thing I want to mention to you is Pei, before being commissioned to do the Islamic Museum, the MIA, had already done several museums, right? He even did one in China in that very garden that I mentioned at the beginning. And actually, this is a drawing which was done by one of my students to sort of show a kind of evolution of Pei's interest and perhaps obsession with geometry. And I think that's the reason why he was so moved when he saw Ibn Tulun, because it was such a perfect example of geometrical principles that he wasn't aware existed. As a matter of fact, he says, he's very honest. He said, I knew nothing about Islam. I even read the autobiography, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to educate myself. And that was a very smart thing to do. So the Three examples I give here. On the left, you have his museum in China, which was completed roughly around the time of the MIA. You can see how he is playing with these geometric elements. And then the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., which has an interesting story. Pei was not happy with the site of the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., so he called up one of the people at the State Department, and he complained that the site had bad feng shui. Do you all know what feng shui is? It's wind and water. The site had bad feng shui. In other words, Pei was not happy with this idea that within the sort of, and this takes us back to phenomenology, the consciousness, one of the aspects of phenomenology is consciousness. The consciousness of the occupants, who were mostly going to be Chinese, was not aligned with the orientation of the site. They were not happy with the way the site was set. And within the Chinese tradition, this idea of feng shui could be good luck or bad luck, right? So Pei, of course, was commissioned to design this, and somehow he was able to work out the feng shui in a way that the client was happy. And then, of course, we have the third example here. You can see almost a kind of a relationship with his use of geometry. The other element I want to talk about is water. Now, in terms of phenomenology, here I want to sort of, I've been mentioning the word, but what does it mean? It has meaning in terms of consciousness. Phenomenology, according to philosophy, is the experience, the philosophy of human experience. It has meaning in terms of consciousness, who we are, how we think, what we believe. It has meaning in terms of our imagination, what we perceive. It has meaning in terms of our relationships with people, which we talk about culture and tradition. Sometimes it's referred to in terms of the urf, the customs. It has meaning in terms of place, where you situate a building. And I just mentioned an example about feng shui. So that is part of phenomenology. And finally, it has meaning in terms of the history and culture of people. The architect, believe it or not, has to consider all of those things. So it's not an easy task. You know, you should have sympathy with us. Many of you, right? It keeps you up at night, you know? So water. Let's talk about water. Many of you know Arabic. You know the Quran refers to water. The famous verse is what? وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ, right? We created every living thing from water, right? So when we talk about the relationship between water and architecture, it's a given. It's there. Now, it may not be in every example that we can think of, but certainly if you go to the Alhambra, one of the quintessential examples of Islamic architecture, 14th century. I remember going there as a student and was completely seduced. I spent a whole week in the Alhambra. I did not want to go back to America. I was like, this is it. If there's paradise on earth, this is it, right? But I had to go back because I have to finish and get a degree, right? So, so water is important. Now, what you see here is a wonderful combination of water and geometry. We've been talking about geometry. So think of this black fountain, the sound of water. Water can be an effervescent sound, the sound of water. In New York City, they refer to the use of water as white noise. I don't know what that means, but white noise. I think it means this is a noise that is peaceful and calming as opposed to other kinds of noise. Why it's white, I don't really know. But anyhow. So here we say Pei being very aware of the value of water as a cultural element, but as a phenomenal element as well, okay? And of course, the other example here, and by the way, the image in the middle is also from the Alhambra, the famous place which is called Generalife, one of the gardens. You see how he has chosen to sort of make a resemblance or replicate the use of running water in one of the courtyards of the MIA. And of course, the reflection as well plays a part when water is used. Am I doing okay, Neda?
Yeah, you're good. Take your time.
Take my time? You mean I can talk more?
Yes, of course you can.
Okay. So, my mom used to tell me, son, stand up, speak up, shut up, and sit down. So this is my last slide. I am honoring my mother today. She would be very proud of me. I don't do that when I'm lecturing to my students. I keep talking, but. So IMP, what I've tried to do today is show you that Islamic architecture is alive. It's a tradition that is very much with us. The difficulty that we have is how do we take that knowledge and that wisdom and bring it into reality? How do we reconcile modernity with tradition? Actually, my first book on Islamic architecture in the United States was sort of driven by more or less what Ibrahim talked about. There's no references. When you're a student, you read Bannister Fletcher, you read European architecture. It's very Eurocentric. There's no cultural, there's no vernacular. So in 2002, while I was a professor at the University of Texas, I wrote Deconstructing the American Mosque to try to show that Islamic architecture has transcended geographical regions of the world. It's now in Europe, it's now in America. So like Ibrahim, I felt this was important to show that where diaspora communities live, they also bring traditions with them. So my concluding statement needs no explanation. Where architects are involved with the idea of beauty. Pei was interested in beauty. Pei actually said an interesting thing. He said, I don't believe in form follows function. I believe in form follows intentions. Intentions. And I really respect him for saying that because that took a lot of courage to break away from the impulse of modernity and to pay respect to history, culture, and tradition. Thank you.